The crowd thought it was part of the show, a smiling young woman riding on the back of SeaWorld's famous killer whale. But in seconds, the spectacle turned to screams. Shamu threw her into the water, clamped his jaws around her leg, and dragged her under. This wasn't a stunt anymore. It was a fight for survival. April 20th, 1971. SeaWorld San Diego. The stands were filled with families, children licking ice cream, parents snapping photos, laughter echoing through the park. They thought they were about to witness a harmless publicity stunt. A pretty young secretary from the park's offices, Annette Eckes, was smiling nervously as she slid onto the back of Shamu, the park's prized orca. She wore a red bikini, chosen by the marketing team to grab attention. The plan was simple. Shamu would carry her across the pool in a dazzling, picture-perfect ride. Cameras were ready. The crowd was ready. Annette tried to steady herself as the massive whale surged forward. But what came next was no choreographed performance. Without warning, Shamu bucked hard. Annette flew into the water, slamming into the surface with a splash. Gasps shot through the audience. Then, horror. The killer whale's jaws snapped shut around her leg. The image is unforgettable. A young woman thrashing in the water. A 5,000-pound predator clamped onto her, dragging her like prey. The cheers turned to screams as parents shielded their children's eyes. This was not entertainment anymore. It was a nightmare unfolding in broad daylight. Shamu had turned on his rider. At first, some thought it was part of the act. SeaWorld was known for pushing spectacle, for blurring the line between danger and showmanship. But the illusion shattered instantly. Annette's scream pierced the air, a sound that no trainer could fake. The red bikini, now streaked with blood, left no room for denial. Parents clutched their children tight. Some people stood frozen, unable to move. Others shouted, "Help her! Somebody help her!" The crowd had come expecting smiles, splashes, and Shamu's famous tricks. Instead, they were witnessing an attack. Raw, brutal, and merciless. From the bleachers, it looked like a tug of war between a fragile young woman and a predator built to dominate the ocean. Shamu would release her for a second, only to lunge again, jaws clamping tighter, pulling her back beneath the surface. Each time she disappeared, hearts stopped. Each time she surfaced, gasping and flailing, it was like a cruel reprieve. Children were sobbing. Some families tried to leave, but many couldn't tear their eyes away. It was horror, unfolding live. A nightmare dressed as a matinee. The message was inescapable. This was not a show. This was survival. And Annette was losing. Panic tore across the pool deck. Trainers who had spent years working beside Shamu suddenly found themselves battling the very creature they were meant to control. They rushed to the water's edge, shouting, slapping the surface, waving their arms, anything to break the orca's grip. But Shamu wasn't responding to cues. She was locked in, thrashing Annette like prey. One trainer hurled a life ring. Another jabbed at the water with a pole. Still, Shamu dove, dragging Annette under. The seconds stretched like hours as bubbles rose to the surface, proof she was still down there. Spectators screamed, convinced she would never resurface. When Annette broke through again, she was choking, bleeding, barely clinging to consciousness. Trainers lunged with hooks and poles, trying to wedge them between Shamu's jaws. The orca snapped back violently, almost pulling one rescuer in with her. It was a chilling reminder. No human strength could match 5 tons of muscle and teeth. Every attempt failed. Every second counted. Trainers realized they weren't just fighting to save Annette. They were fighting against the very myth they'd sold the public, that these whales could ever truly be controlled. Shamu wasn't a performer now. She was a predator. Just as rescuers thought they might tear Annette free, Shamu lunged again. The orca twisted her massive body, clamping down harder, and with a violent sweep of her tail dragged Annette deep beneath the surface. The crowd's screams turned to silence. From above, there was nothing but froth and red-tinted water. Seconds ticked by. 10, 20, 30. Too long. People on deck began to believe she was gone. Below the surface, Annette was being ragdolled, her lungs burning as Shamu thrashed her like a toy. She clawed at the water, at the whale's smooth black skin, desperate for air. But Shamu only tightened her grip, refusing to release. Then, suddenly, Annette broke the surface again, gasping, blood streaming down her leg. Trainers threw themselves flat against the pool edge, reaching with poles and hooks, desperately trying to pry her free. The water churned violently as Shamu fought back, jaws locked tight. It was chaos. The illusion of control was shattered. This wasn't a show anymore. It was life and death. An orca proving that for all their training, humans were powerless in her world. When Annette surfaced again, her scream pierced through the chaos. Shamu's jaws tore into her thigh, and the pool rippled red. The spectacle people had come to cheer turned into a nightmare unfolding in slow motion. Families clutched their children, some crying, others frozen in disbelief. On the deck, trainers shouted orders no one could follow fast enough. They thrust poles into the water, striking Shamu, prying at her jaws, anything to force the whale to release. But Shamu held tight, thrashing her head side to side, dragging Annette through crimson foam. Every second stretched into eternity. Annette's leg was shredded, blood trailing in a cloud behind her. The horror was undeniable now. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't part of any show. It was raw violence, a predator asserting her power in front of thousands. Finally, with a brutal tug, Shamu released her, only to lunge again, nudging Annette like prey. Trainers managed to yank her toward the edge, hands clawing desperately at her arms, pulling her half out of the water. Annette's face was ghost white, her body trembling, her leg mangled. The audience had fallen silent. The pool that once symbolized family entertainment was now stained with blood. The trainers knew. They had only seconds before Shamu struck again. Annette, half in the water, half out, was slipping back toward the pool. Her blood soaked the deck, her screams weakening. One trainer jammed a steel pole between Shamu's jaws, pushing with every ounce of strength as the orca surged up, snapping at Annette's dangling leg. Another grabbed her under the arms, his muscles trembling as the weight of her soaked body dragged him forward. "Hold on!" someone shouted, though everyone knew it wasn't Annette letting go. It was Shamu refusing to give her up. The whale thrashed, her sheer mass sending waves crashing against the platform. Annette's head dipped below the surface again, bubbles erupting from her mouth as she choked on the water. The crowd gasped, 1,000 voices sucked into silence. And then, with one final wrench, the trainers yanked her free. Annette collapsed on the deck, her skin pale, her body limp, blood pouring from deep puncture wounds in her thigh. Shamu circled below, black and white shadows slicing through the water, waiting. For the first time in SeaWorld's history, the spectacle had crossed into sheer survival. A young woman lay broken, and Shamu still wasn't finished. Annette's body lay sprawled across the slick platform, her leg torn open, crimson streaks pooling beneath her. The trainers pressed towels and hands against the wounds, but the bleeding kept coming. She was shaking violently, her lips trembling as she gasped for air. The crowd, once roaring with applause, was now frozen in a nightmare silence. Children clung to their parents, some crying, others staring wide-eyed at the blood staining the water. A father muttered, "That whale almost killed her," as Shamu circled below, unbothered, her dorsal fin slicing through the pool like a blade. Two men lifted Annette onto a stretcher, her head lolled to one side, her eyes glazed with shock. "Stay with us, Annette!" a trainer shouted, but she could barely respond. The entire illusion of control, SeaWorld's smiling facade, was shattered in that moment. As they rushed her toward the first aid station, the audience remained glued to their seats, some too stunned to move, others desperate to leave. Behind them, Shamu surfaced, exhaling a violent spout of mist, as if claiming victory. It wasn't just a stunt gone wrong anymore. It was a public spectacle turned into a bloody reminder. This was never a show. It was a struggle to survive. By nightfall, the story was everywhere. Local TV stations interrupted programming with shocking images of a young woman on a stretcher, her leg wrapped in blood-soaked bandages. The headline burned across the screen: "Shamu attacks SeaWorld secretary." The press descended on SeaWorld's gates the next morning. Reporters shoved microphones at staff, demanding answers. Why was a secretary riding a killer whale? Was she trained? Was this safe? The park's polished spokesperson tried to smile through the chaos, but the cracks showed. Annette's face, wide-eyed and pale on the stretcher, splashed across newspapers from California to New York. What was meant to be a glittering publicity stunt had mutated into a PR disaster. Parents who once dreamed of taking their children to see Shamu now whispered in fear, "If this could happen to her, what might happen to us?" SeaWorld scrambled to spin the narrative. They called it a rare accident, insisting the whale hadn't meant harm. But whispers swirled among trainers. Shamu had shown aggression before. Management knew. And still, they put Annette in the water. The media frenzy wouldn't let go. The image of Shamu, the smiling icon of family fun, was now tainted with blood. And SeaWorld was suddenly fighting for its reputation. Annette Eckes didn't just leave SeaWorld with scars on her leg. She left with a wound to her dignity. She had been humiliated, paraded as a stunt gone wrong, and nearly killed in front of hundreds. And she wasn't about to stay silent. Weeks after the attack, Annette filed a lawsuit against SeaWorld. She demanded $1.3 million, claiming the park had pressured her into a stunt she wasn't trained for. Her attorneys painted a damning picture. A young secretary, thrown into the tank with a 5-ton predator, all for cheap publicity. SeaWorld fought back hard. Their legal team argued Annette had volunteered, that she knew the risks, that Shamu hadn't intended to harm her. In the courtroom, the company's lawyers tried to twist her into the villain, an overzealous secretary who wanted the spotlight. But the photos didn't lie. The stretcher, the stitches, the fear etched on her face. For many it was clear. SeaWorld had gambled with her life. The case dragged on, but in the end, the multi-million-dollar award was overturned. Annette walked away with nothing, except her scars, her trauma, and the bitter truth that in the battle of a young woman versus a corporate giant, the giant won. Before April 1971, Shamu was SeaWorld's crown jewel, the smiling face of the park, the gentle giant that drew in families by the thousands. She was the safe killer whale, the one who flipped trainers into the air, balanced balls, and kissed children on cue. But after Annette Eckes' blood stained the pool, that illusion cracked. The media erupted with headlines. Shamu attacks girl. SeaWorld's killer whale turns. For the first time, the world saw past the glossy brochures. Behind the tricks and smiles was a predator, 5 tons of muscle, teeth, and instinct. SeaWorld scrambled to protect its brand. They downplayed the attack, calling it an accident, a misunderstanding. But the public wasn't convinced. Mothers who once cheered in the bleachers now wondered, could this whale do it again? Was Shamu truly safe? Inside the park, trainers whispered. Some admitted they had seen warning signs, sudden bursts of aggression, unpredictable moods. But those whispers never reached the public. Shamu's reputation was forever stained. No longer just an entertainer, she became a symbol of danger in captivity. And beneath the surface, a chilling truth lingered. If the star of the show could attack, what did that say about the industry itself? Annette Eckes' mauling wasn't just a freak accident. It was the first spark in a fire that would burn for decades. Shamu's attack marked the beginning of a chilling pattern, a pattern of whales turning on their trainers. SeaWorld tried to bury it, to paint it as a one-time mishap. But history proved otherwise. Again and again, killer whales in captivity lashed out. Some incidents were minor. A trainer dragged, a bite, a near drowning. Others were catastrophic, ending in deaths that made global headlines. And every time, the shadow of that day in 1971 loomed larger. Annette's attack was a warning, written in blood across the surface of the pool. Killer whales are not performers, and captivity warps their instincts. The name Shamu lived on, passed to other whales as if the brand could erase the danger. But the truth could not be hidden. Behind the marketing, behind the costumes and smiles, these were apex predators, massive, intelligent, and unpredictable. Annette survived, but her encounter left scars that went far beyond her leg. It left a question hanging in the air. How many warnings would it take before the world finally listened? Annette Eckes was lucky. She left SeaWorld on a stretcher, bleeding and terrified, but alive. Many who came after her wouldn't be so fortunate. Her attack became a dark prelude to a long line of tragedies, proof that captivity could twist even the most majestic animals into ticking time bombs. For Annette, the experience ended her brief flirtation with fame and left her with scars, physical and emotional, that never truly faded. She had trusted the illusion, the promise that Shamu was tame, safe, controllable. That illusion shattered in seconds. For SeaWorld, the attack should have been a reckoning. Instead, they doubled down, turning Shamu into a brand, a mask to cover the truth. Behind the smiling billboards and carefully choreographed shows, whales raged, trainers risked their lives, and the water ran red more than once. Annette's story is a haunting reminder. Wildness cannot be caged. You can dress it up, give it a stage, call it entertainment, but deep down, nature never forgets what it is. And on that day in 1971, in front of a stunned audience, Shamu reminded the world with teeth. Annette Eckes survived her brutal encounter with Shamu, but her blood in the water was only the beginning of a chilling pattern that would haunt SeaWorld for decades. If this story gripped you, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next tale of humans colliding with nature's raw power. And coming up, another shocking story where captivity turned deadly. One you won't believe until you hear it. But not all tragedies happen in captivity. In the open waters off Sydney, Australia, another life would be lost. This time, to the ocean's most feared predator. This is the story of Simon Nellist. A calm Sydney afternoon, a lone swimmer gliding just beyond the rocks. Then, a violent surge beneath the surface. In seconds, the sea turned red. Onlookers screamed from the cliffs as a great white shark dragged Simon Nellist under. It was Sydney's first fatal shark attack in nearly 60 years, and it claimed the life of a man who loved the ocean and believed sharks should never be killed. This is his story. It was just after 4:30 p.m. on February 16, 2022. The waves at Little Bay rolled lazily toward shore, the kind of afternoon that lulled locals into forgetting the ocean's darker truths. On the cliffs above, fishermen cast their lines. Joggers passed along the coastal track. And in the turquoise water, one man swam with the easy confidence of someone completely at home in the sea. That man was Simon Nellist. 35 years old, a former Royal Air Force serviceman, a dive instructor, and a passionate conservationist. He was preparing for the biggest chapter of his life, a wedding just months away. Friends said he was the happiest they had ever seen him. Simon wasn't just a swimmer. He was a man who belonged to the water. He had served in Afghanistan, but the ocean was where he found peace. He lived in Sydney, worked with marine life, and often spoke of his deep respect for sharks. In fact, he was outspoken against shark nets, believing they did more harm than good. This afternoon, none of that mattered. As Simon glided parallel to the rocks, unaware, the stage was already set for the unthinkable. A shadow, vast and silent, was closing in from below. What happened next would shatter Sydney's illusion of safety, silence the waves with screams, and etch Simon Nellist's name into history as the victim of the city's first fatal shark attack in nearly 60 years. Sydney is a city that lives with the ocean at its doorstep. Bondi, Coogee, Manly, these beaches are not just places to swim. They are part of the city's identity. Generations have grown up with sand between their toes and salt in their hair. And yet, despite millions of people entering the water every year, fatal shark attacks here were almost mythical, a thing of the past. The last time Sydney had witnessed one was 1963, nearly 6 decades of safety. 60 years of parents reassuring their children, "It's fine, nothing's going to happen." The ocean was vast, yes, but for the people of Sydney, it was also safe. That long stretch of calm created something dangerous: complacency. When you go 60 years without a tragedy, it stops feeling possible. But the truth was always lurking beneath the waves. Sydney sits on Australia's east coast, along a migratory path for sharks. Great whites patrol these waters. Bull sharks venture upriver. Tiger sharks roam the reefs. People knew they were there. Yet the absence of blood in the water gave rise to the illusion of control. That illusion shattered on February 16, 2022. The day Simon Nellist went for his swim, no one on the cliffs thought they'd be witnessing a nightmare. They had no idea they'd see something Sydney hadn't seen in a lifetime. The ocean reminding humans exactly where they stand in the food chain. When the attack came, it was sudden, brutal, public. and the city that had convinced itself it was safe would never look at its beaches the same way again. Little Bay is one of Sydney's hidden gems. On most afternoons, it feels like a secret. Calm water, golden sandstone cliffs, and the faint laughter of families picnicking on the grass above. On February 16, 2022, the sea looked perfect. Clear, calm, harmless. The kind of water that lures even the cautious further from shore. For Simon Nellist, it was nothing unusual. He often swam at Little Bay, training in the open ocean, keeping himself fit and at peace in the water he loved most. From the cliffs, fishermen watched as he glided past the headland, his arms cutting smoothly through the water. To them, it looked like routine, just another swimmer in the late afternoon sun. But beneath that serene surface, something vast was moving. A shadow, circling, closing the distance. A predator built to kill in silence. Simon had no reason to know. He wasn't far offshore, barely beyond the rocks. He had done this swim countless times. But in that moment, the ocean that had always embraced him was about to betray him. Witnesses later said the water looked postcard perfect until the very second it wasn't. 1 minute, a swimmer. The next, chaos. What unfolded next would not only devastate Simon's loved ones, but leave Sydney reeling. Forced to face the unthinkable truth, the sea is never as safe as it looks. Beneath the turquoise calm of Little Bay, a hunter prowled. A great white shark, 3 meters long, nearly the size of a car, slid silently through the deep. For hours, perhaps days, it had been moving along Sydney's coast, following the ancient instincts etched into its bloodline. Great whites are apex predators, perfectly evolved to strike with explosive speed. Their rows of serrated teeth capable of sawing through bone in seconds. This shark was no monster in the way humans imagine them. It wasn't hunting people. But to a great white, the blur of a black wetsuit can look like a seal. To an apex predator, hesitation is death. And so, from the depths, the shark committed. On the cliffs above, no one knew. They fished, chatted, glanced at the lone swimmer below, unaware that the ocean's deadliest silhouette was aligning its path. A great white attack happens in seconds. One surge of muscle, a burst of over 30 kilometers an hour, and impact hits like a car crash. Victims rarely see it coming, and Simon Nellist never did. In the span of a heartbeat, the illusion of safety dissolved. The predator had chosen. The strike was imminent. It happened in an instant. One moment, Simon was swimming in smooth, calm strokes, his body gliding parallel to the cliffs. Next, the ocean itself erupted. A flash of white belly, a violent surge, and a wall of muscle and teeth exploded from below. The shark struck with catastrophic force, its jaws clamping onto Simon's side and thigh. Eyewitnesses said the water around him turned red in seconds. The sea that had been postcard perfect just moments earlier became a scene of primal violence. From the cliffs, horrified onlookers screamed. Fishermen dropped their rods, helplessly staring as the predator thrashed with its prey. Someone began filming on their phone. The footage later confirmed the nightmare. Simon was dragged under, the shark circling back, attacking again. Witnesses would describe it as relentless. Every time Simon tried to surface, the great white cut him off, forcing him down. It wasn't a quick hit and release. It was a sustained, brutal assault. The cliffs echoed with shouts, but there was nothing anyone could do. The attack unfolded just meters from shore, yet might as well have been miles away. By the time rescuers arrived, it was already too late. Simon had suffered what officials later called catastrophic injuries. For the people on those cliffs, it was like watching a nightmare play out in broad daylight. Sydney's first fatal shark attack in nearly 60 years, and it was happening before their eyes. From the cliffs of Little Bay, the peaceful afternoon shattered into a scene no one could ever forget. At first it was confusion, shouts from a fisherman, someone pointing at the water, a splash that seemed too violent to be a swimmer's stroke. Then the truth hit. A massive shark was thrashing just meters from the rocks, and a man was caught in its grip. Phones came up, hands shaking, as people tried to capture proof of what their minds refused to accept. The sea around Simon turned crimson. His desperate movements, arms flailing against something far stronger, burned into the memories of everyone watching. It was like a car hitting the water, one witness later said. You could see the power. Another voice screamed, "Shark! Somebody's in there!" But there was nothing anyone could do. They were frozen on the cliffs, separated from the unfolding nightmare by only meters of air and stone. Some couldn't watch. Others couldn't look away. The cries, the splashing, the stillness after. It all played out in horrifying clarity, like a scene that would haunt them forever. Sydney hadn't seen a fatal shark attack in 60 years. Now, on a sunny afternoon at a quiet cove, dozens of ordinary people had just witnessed one with their own eyes. By the time lifeguards and rescue boats reached Little Bay, the ocean was calm again, eerily calm. The shark had vanished into the depths, leaving behind only a slick of blood drifting on the surface. Search crews scanned frantically, their eyes darting across the water for any sign of Simon, but it was already too late. What they found confirmed what the witnesses on the cliff had feared. Simon had suffered what authorities later called catastrophic injuries. The brutality of the attack was undeniable. The rescuers pulled what little they could from the water, their grim silence saying more than any words could. For many of them, hardened by years of emergencies, this was something different, something almost impossible to process. Police sealed off the beach, helicopters buzzed overhead, sirens echoed through the quiet neighborhood as the news spread like wildfire. Sydney's first fatal shark attack in nearly 6 decades had just unfolded in broad daylight. On the cliffs, people wept. Others simply stood in shock, staring out at the bay, replaying the horror again and again in their minds. The sea, moments ago so inviting, had become a crime scene, and the reality set in. There was no saving Simon Nellist. Simon Nellist wasn't just another swimmer in the ocean. He was a man who lived for it. At 35, Simon had built a life defined by adventure. A former Royal Air Force serviceman, he'd traveled the world, carrying the discipline of a soldier and the heart of a free spirit. He had settled in Sydney not by accident, but because of what it gave him. Cliffs to climb, skies to dive, and seas to swim. Friends described him as fearless, but grounded. He loved the thrill of the water, but he also respected it. He taught diving, encouraged others to embrace the ocean, and wrote passionately about the need to protect marine life. Unlike most who feared sharks, Simon defended them. He openly opposed shark nets and culling, arguing that the ocean belonged to them long before it belonged to humans. And then there was the most personal piece of his story. Simon was in love, deeply in love. He was engaged, about to be married, and friends said he was the happiest he had ever been. That's what makes his death so haunting. The ocean he revered, the predator he respected, claimed him in its most violent form. A man who spoke for sharks, taken by one. The cruelest irony, and perhaps the reason his story shook Sydney so deeply, is that Simon Nellist was exactly the kind of man who would never have wanted vengeance. Even in death, he would have wanted people to remember one truth: the ocean is wild, and sharks are not villains. But that knowledge offered little comfort to those who loved him. For them, the tragedy was not just the horror of his death, but the brilliance of a life cut short. News of the attack spread through Sydney like wildfire. Within hours, Little Bay was no longer just a quiet coastal suburb. It was the site of a tragedy that gripped an entire nation. Helicopters scoured the shoreline. Drones hovered above the waves. Police boats cut across the water, armed with sonar and surveillance, desperate to track the shark that had killed a man in full view of the cliffs. Beaches across the city slammed shut. Signs went up warning swimmers to stay away. For many, it was unthinkable. Sydney hadn't seen a fatal shark attack in nearly 60 years. Generations had grown up believing it couldn't happen here, not anymore. But now, reality crashed through that illusion. The ocean, Australia's pride, its playground, suddenly felt dangerous again. At Little Bay, flowers and notes began to appear. Strangers who had never known Simon Nellist came to stand on the same cliffs where witnesses had screamed just hours before. Some prayed. Others stared silently at the surf, as if expecting the sea itself to offer answers. The attack didn't just take Simon's life. It took Sydney's sense of safety. And in the days that followed, fear and grief collided in ways the city hadn't felt for decades. Simon Nellist's story wasn't just about the moment he died. It was about the life he was building, one that ended too soon. At 35, Simon had lived boldly. A former RAF serviceman, he'd traveled the world, diving in some of its most dangerous waters. Friends said the ocean was his sanctuary. But what made his death unbearably tragic wasn't just that he loved the sea. It was that his future was right in front of him. He was engaged. Wedding plans were already in motion. He'd found someone who shared his love of life, and those close to him said he was the happiest he had ever been. He wasn't drifting. He was settled, grounded, ready for the next chapter. When the shark struck, it didn't just take a swimmer. It took a fiancé, a son, a brother, a friend. In a single violent moment, everything he was, and everything he would have been, was gone. And that is what makes his death so haunting. It wasn't just rare, it wasn't just brutal. It was the shattering of a life in its brightest moment. Proof that sometimes nature takes without reason, leaving only devastation in its wake. Simon's death did more than devastate, it divided. Almost immediately, the familiar battle lines were drawn. On one side were those demanding action. Kill the shark. Deploy more nets. We can't let this happen again. Fear had a voice, and it was loud. On the other side were conservationists, and many who knew Simon personally. They reminded the public of who he was. Simon loved the ocean. He defended sharks. He spoke openly against culling and nets. Friends said he would have hated to think his death could be used as justification for killing the very animals he respected. But fear doesn't bow easily to reason. Nightly news ran footage of helicopters sweeping beaches, shark drones buzzing the coast, and debates over safety versus conservation erupted on every platform. Could Sydney protect swimmers without declaring war on its marine life? Could any system ever guarantee safety in a wild ocean? The questions hung heavy. The city was grieving, angry, terrified, and torn between honoring Simon's memory and preventing another tragedy. In that tension, one truth emerged. The ocean will never be risk-free. And Simon Nellist had known that better than anyone. Simon Nellist's story is not just about a shark attack. It is about a man who gave his life to the sea and lost it in a way almost too brutal to comprehend. He was about to marry the woman he loved. He had survived military service, traveled the world, and found peace in Sydney's waves. He advocated for sharks, for the very creatures that would ultimately take him. The attack was shocking because of its rarity. Sydney had not seen a fatal shark strike in 60 years, yet on that quiet afternoon at Little Bay, fate chose Simon. His death shattered illusions of safety, ignited fear across a city, and rekindled the eternal question: how do we share the ocean with predators that can kill us in seconds? But perhaps the cruelest twist is also the most haunting. Simon would not have wanted vengeance. His friends insisted he would have wanted understanding, respect for sharks, even after his own blood stained the water. The final image lingers. A devoted fiancé, a soldier-turned-ocean lover, taken in an instant by the wild he cherished. A reminder that the sea is never ours. It only ever allows us to enter. Simon Nellist's death was a tragedy that stunned a city and rippled across the world. A reminder that when we enter the ocean, we step into a realm where we are no longer at the top of the food chain. If this story gripped you, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss our next deep dive into true stories of man versus nature. Up next, another tale just as shocking. One you won't believe until you hear it.